Chapter 5. Energy 1. Sun Tzu said, "The control of a large force is the same principle as the control of a few men. It is merely a question of dividing up their numbers. That is, cutting up the army into regiments, companies, etc., with subordinate officers in command of each." Tu Mu reminds us of Han Hsin's famous reply to the first Han Emperor, who once said to him, "How large an army do you think I could lead?" "Not more than 100,000 men, Your Majesty." "And you?" asked the emperor. "Oh," he answered, "the more the better." 2. Fighting with a large army under your command is no wise different from fighting with a small one. It is merely a question of instituting signs and signals. 3. To ensure that your whole host may withstand the brunt of the enemy's attack and remain unshaken. This is effected by maneuvers direct and indirect. We now come to one of the most interesting parts of Sun Tzu's treatise, the discussion of the cheng and the chai. As it is by no means easy to grasp the full significance of these two terms, or to render them consistently by good English equivalents, it may be as well to tabulate some of the commentators' remarks on the subject before proceeding further. Li Chuan. Facing the enemy is cheng. Making lateral diversion is chai. Yelin. In presence of the enemy, your troops should be arrayed in normal fashion, but in order to secure victory, abnormal maneuvers must be employed. Mei Yao Qian. Qi is active. Cheng is passive. Passivity means waiting for an opportunity. Activity brings the victory itself. Hoshi. We must cause the enemy to regard our straightforward attack as one that is secretly designed, and vice versa. Thus cheng may also be chai, and chai may also be cheng. He instances the famous exploit of Han Hsin, who, when marching ostensibly against Lin Qin, now Chao Ai and Shenxi, suddenly threw a large force across the Yellow River in wooden tubs, utterly disconcerting his opponent. Yan Han Shu chapter. B. Here, we are told. The march on Lin Qin was cheng, and the surprise maneuver was chai. Chang Yu gives the following summary of opinions on the words. Military writers do not agree with regard to the meaning of qi and cheng. Wei Liao Tzu, 4th cent. E.C. says, direct warfare favors frontal attacks. Indirect warfare attacks from the rear. Thus, Ao Kung says, going straight out to join battle is a direct operation. Appearing on the enemy's rear is an indirect maneuver. Li Weikung, 6th and 7th cent. A.D. says, in war, to march straight ahead is cheng, turning movements. On the other hand, are chai. These writers simply regard cheng as cheng and chai as chuk. They do not note that the two are mutually interchangeable and run into each other like the two sides of a circle, see infra. 11. A comment on the Taiyang Emperor Ti Sung goes to the root of the matter. A Xie maneuver may be cheng. If we make the enemy look upon it as cheng, then our real attack will be qi, and vice versa. The whole secret lies in confusing the enemy, so that he cannot fathom our real intent. To put it perhaps a little more clearly, any attack or other operation is cheng, on which the enemy has had his attention fixed, whereas that is che, which takes him by surprise or comes from an unexpected quarter. If the enemy perceives a movement which is meant to be qi, it immediately becomes cheng. 4. That the impact of your army may be like a grindstone dashed against an egg. This is affected by the science of weak points and strong. 5. In all fighting, the direct method may be used for joining battle, but indirect methods will be needed in order to secure victory. Kang Yu says, steadily develop indirect tactics, either by pounding the enemy's flanks or falling on his rear. A brilliant example of indirect tactics, which decided the fortunes of a campaign, was Lord Roberts' night march around the Peshawar Kotal in the Second Afghan War. 1.6. Indirect tactics, efficiently applied, are inexhaustible as heaven and earth, unending as the flow of rivers and streams. Like the sun and moon, they end but to begin anew. Like the four seasons, they pass away but to return once more. Tu Yu and Chang Yu understand this of the permutations of chai and cheng. But at present, Sun Tzu is not speaking of cheng at all, unless, indeed, we suppose with Han Hsin that a clause relating to it has fallen out of the text. Of course, as has already been pointed out, the two are so inextricably interwoven in all military operations that they cannot really be considered apart. Here we simply have an expression, in figurative language, of the almost infinite resource of a great leader. 7. There are not more than 5 musical notes, yet the combinations of these 5 give rise to more melodies than can ever be heard. 8. There are not more than 5 primary colors: blue, yellow, red, white, and black. Yet, in combination, they produce more hues than can ever be seen. 9. There are not more than 5 cardinal tastes: sour, acrid, salt, sweet, bitter. Yet combinations of them yield more flavors than can ever be tasted. 10. In battle, there are not more than 2 methods of attack, the direct and the indirect. Yet these two in combination give rise to an endless series of maneuvers. 11. The direct and the indirect lead onto each other in turn. It is like moving in a circle. You never come to an end. Who can exhaust the possibilities of their combination? 12. The onset of troops is like the rush of a torrent, which will even roll stones along in its course. 13. The quality of decision is like the well-timed swoop of a falcon, which enables it to strike and destroy its victim. The Chinese here is tricky, and a certain key word in the context it is used defies the best efforts of the translator. Chu Mu defines this word as the measurement or estimation of distance. But this meaning does not quite fit the illustrative simile in ver. 15. Applying this definition to the falcon, it seems to me to denote that instinct of self-restraint which keeps the bird from swooping on its quarry until the right moment, together with the power of judging when the right moment has arrived. The analogous quality in soldiers is the highly important one of being able to reserve their fire until the very instant at which it will be most effective. When the Victory went into action at Trafalgar at hardly more than drifting pace, she was for several minutes exposed to a storm of shot and shell before replying with a single gun. Nelson coolly waited until he was within close range, when the broadside he brought to bear worked fearful havoc on the enemy's nearest ships. 14. Therefore, the good fighter will be terrible in his onset, and prompt in his decision. The word decision would have reference to the measurement of distance mentioned above, letting the enemy get near before striking. But I cannot help thinking that Sun Tzu meant to use the word in a figurative sense, comparable to our own idiom short and sharp. Cf. Wang Xi's note, which, after describing the falcon's mode of attack, proceeds, "This is just how the psychological moment should be seized in war." 15. Energy may be likened to the bending of a crossbow, decision to the releasing of the trigger. None of the commentators seem to grasp the real point of the simile of energy and the force stored up in the bent crossbow until released by the finger on the trigger. 16. Amid the turmoil and tumult of battle, there may be seeming disorder, and yet no real disorder at all. Amid confusion and chaos, your array may be without head or tail, yet it will be proof against defeat. Mei Yao Chen says, "The subdivisions of the army having been previously fixed, and the various signals agreed upon, the separating and joining, the dispersing and collecting, which will take place in the course of a battle, may give the appearance of disorder when no real disorder is possible. Your formation may be without head or tail, your dispositions all topsy-turvy, and yet a rout of your forces quite out of the question." 17. Simulated disorder postulates perfect discipline. Simulated fear postulates courage. Simulated weakness postulates strength. In order to make the translation intelligible, it is necessary to tone down the sharply paradoxical form of the original. Hao Kung throws out a hint of the meaning in his brief note. These things all serve to destroy formation and conceal one's condition. But Tu Mu is the first to put it quite plainly. If you wish to feign confusion in order to lure the enemy on, you must first have perfect discipline. If you wish to display timidity in order to entrap the enemy, you must have extreme courage. If you wish to parade your weakness in order to make the enemy overconfident, you must have exceeding strength. 18. Hiding order beneath the cloak of disorder is simply a question of subdivision. Supra. 1. Concealing courage under a show of timidity presupposes a fund of latent energy. The commentators strongly understand a certain Chinese word here differently than anywhere else in this chapter. Thus, Tu Mu says, seeing that we are favorably circumstanced, and yet make no move, the enemy will believe that we are really afraid. Masking strength with weakness is to be effected by tactical dispositions. Cheng Yu relates the following anecdote of Cao Tzu, the first Han Emperor. Wishing to crush the Sengnu, he sent out spies to report on their condition. But the Xiannu, forewarned, carefully concealed all their able-bodied men and well-fed horses, and only allowed infirm soldiers and emaciated cattle to be seen. The result was that spies one and all recommended the emperor to deliver his attack. Lu Qing alone opposed them, saying, "When two countries go to war, they are naturally inclined to make an ostentatious display of their strength. Yet our spies have seen nothing but old age and infirmity. This is surely some ruse on the part of the enemy, and it would be unwise for us to attack." The emperor, however, disregarding this advice, fell into the trap and found himself surrounded at Poteng. 19. Thus one who is skillful at keeping the enemy on the move maintains deceitful appearances, according to which the enemy will act. Ao Kung's note is make a display of weakness and want. Tu Mu says, if our force happens to be superior to the enemy's, weakness may be simulated in order to lure him on, but if inferior, he must be led to believe that we are strong, in order that he may keep off. In fact, all the enemy's movements should be determined by the signs that we choose to give him. Note the following anecdote of Sun Pin, a descendant of Sun Wu. In 341 BC, the Chai state being at war with Wei, sent Tian Qi and Sun Pin against the general Piang Chuan, who happened to be a deadly personal enemy of the latter. Sun Pin said, "The Chai state has a reputation for cowardice, and therefore our adversary despises us. Let us turn this circumstance to account." Accordingly, when the army had crossed the border into Wei territory, he gave orders to show 100,000 fires on the first night, 50,000 on the next, and the night after only 20,000. Chuan pursued them hotly, saying to himself, "I knew these men of Chai were cowards. Their numbers have already fallen away by more than half." In his retreat, Sun Pin came to a narrow defile, which he calculated that his pursuers would reach after dark. Here he had a tree stripped of its bark, and inscribed upon it the words, "Under this tree shall Pang Chuan die." Then, as night began to fall, he placed a strong body of archers in ambush nearby, with orders to shoot directly if they saw a light. Later on, Piang Chuan arrived at the spot, and noticing the tree, struck a light in order to read what was written on it. His body was immediately riddled by a volley of arrows, and his whole army thrown into confusion. The above is Tu Mu's version of the story. The Shi Qi, less dramatically, but probably with more historical truth, makes Pang Chuan cut his own throat with an exclamation of despair after the rout of his army. He sacrifices something that the enemy may snatch at it. 20. By holding out baits, he keeps him on the march. Then with a body of picked men he lies in wait for him. With an emendation suggested by Li Qing, this then reads, he lies in wait with the main body of his troops. 21. The clever combatant looks to the effect of combined energy, and does not require too much from individuals. Tu Mu says, he first of all considers the power of his army in the bulk. Afterwards, he takes individual talent into account, and uses each man according to his capabilities. He does not demand perfection from the untalented, hence his ability to pick out the right men and utilize combined energy. 22. When he utilizes combined energy, his fighting men become, as it were, like unto rolling logs or stones. For it is the nature of a log or stone to remain motionless on level ground, and to move when on a slope. If four-cornered, to come to a standstill, but if round-shaped, to go rolling down. Ao Kung calls this the use of natural or inherent power. 23. Thus, the energy developed by good fighting men is as the momentum of a round stone rolled down a mountain thousands of feet in height. So much on the subject of energy. The chief lesson of this chapter, in Tu Mu's opinion, is the paramount importance in war of rapid evolutions and sudden rushes. Great results, he adds, can thus be achieved with small forces. 1. 41 Years in India, Chapter 46. Chapter 6. Weak Points and Strong. Chang Yu attempts to explain the sequence of chapters as follows. Chapter 4. On Tactical Dispositions. Treated of the offensive and the defensive. Chapter 5. On Energy. Dealt with direct and indirect methods. The good general acquaints himself first with the theory of attack and defense, and then turns his attention to direct and indirect methods. He studies the art of varying and combining these two methods before proceeding to the subject of weak and strong points. For the use of direct or indirect methods arises out of attack and defense, and the perception of weak and strong points depends again on the above methods. Hence, the present chapter comes immediately after the chapter on energy. 1. Sun Tzu said, "Whoever is first in the field and awaits the coming of the enemy will be fresh for the fight. Whoever is second in the field and has to hasten to battle will arrive exhausted." 2. Therefore, the clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him. One mark of a great soldier is that he fight on his own terms, or fights not at all. 1-3. By holding out advantages to him, he can cause the enemy to approach of his own accord, or by inflicting damage, he can make it impossible for the enemy to draw near. In the first case, he will entice him with a bait. In the second, he will strike at some important point which the enemy will have to defend. 4. If the enemy is taking his ease, he can harass him. This passage may be cited as evidence against Mei Yaoqian's interpretation of I-23. If well supplied with food, he can starve him out. If quietly encamped, he can force him to move. 5. Appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend. March swiftly to places where you are not expected. 6. An army may march great distances without distress if it marches through country where the enemy is not. Ao Kung sums up very well. Emerge from the void, TG, like a bolt from the blue. Strike at vulnerable points. Shun places that are defended. Attack in unexpected quarters. 7. You can be sure of succeeding in your attacks if you only attack places which are undefended. Wang Xi explains undefended places as weak points. That is to say, where the general is lacking in capacity, or the soldiers in spirit, where the walls are not strong enough, or the precautions not strict enough, where relief comes too late, or provisions are too scanty, or the defenders are variants amongst themselves. You can ensure the safety of your defense if you only hold positions that cannot be attacked. E. Where there are none of the weak points mentioned above. There is rather a nice point involved in the interpretation of this later clause. Tu Mu, and Hao, and Mei Yaoqian assume the meaning to be, in order to make your defense quite safe, you must defend even those places that are not likely to be attacked. And Tu Mu adds, how much more, then, those that will be attacked. Taken thus, however, the clause balances less well with the preceding, always a consideration in the highly antithetical style which is natural to the Chinese. Cheng Yu, therefore, seems to come nearer the mark in saying, he who is skilled in attack flashes forth from the topmost heights of heaven. CIV 7, making it impossible for the enemy to guard against him. This being so, the places that I shall attack are precisely those that the enemy cannot defend. He who is skilled in defense hides in the most secret recesses of the earth, making it impossible for the enemy to estimate his whereabouts. This being so, the places that I shall hold are precisely those that the enemy cannot attack. 8. Hence, that general is skillful in attack, whose opponent does not know what to defend, and he is skillful in defense, whose opponent does not know what to attack. An aphorism which puts the whole art of war in a nutshell. 9. O divine art of subtlety and secrecy! Through you we learn to be invisible, through you inaudible. Literally, without form or sound, but it is said of course with reference to the enemy, and hence we can hold the enemy's fate in our hands. 10. You may advance and be absolutely irresistible if you make for the enemy's weak points. You may retire and be safe from pursuit if your movements are more rapid than those of the enemy. 11. If we wish to fight, the enemy can be forced to an engagement even though he be sheltered behind a high rampart and a deep ditch. All we need do is attack some other place that he will be obliged to relieve. 2. Mu says, if the enemy is the invading party, we can cut his line of communications and occupy the roads by which he will have to return. If we are the invaders, we may direct our attack against the sovereign himself. It is clear that Sun Tzu, unlike certain generals in the late Boer War, was no believer in frontal attacks. 12. If we do not wish to fight, we can prevent the enemy from engaging us, even though the lines of our encampment be merely traced out on the ground. All we need do is to throw something odd and unaccountable in his way. This extremely concise expression is intelligibly paraphrased by Chia Lin, even though we have constructed neither wall nor ditch. Li Chuan says, we puzzle him by strange and unusual dispositions. And Tu Mu finally clinches the meaning by 3 illustrative anecdotes. One of Chuko Lian, who, when occupying Yangping and about to be attacked by Sima Ai, suddenly struck his colors, stopped the beating of the drums, and flung open the city gates, showing only a few men engaged in sweeping and sprinkling the ground. This unexpected proceeding had the intended effect, for Sima Ai, suspecting an ambush, actually drew off his army and retreated. What Sun Tzu is advocating here, therefore, is nothing more nor less than the timely use of bluff. 13. By discovering the enemy's dispositions and remaining invisible ourselves, we can keep our forces concentrated, while the enemy's must be divided. The conclusion is perhaps not very obvious, but Chang Yu, after Mei Yao Chan, rightly explains it thus. If the enemy's dispositions are visible, we can make for him in one body, whereas our own dispositions being kept secret, the enemy will be obliged to divide his forces in order to guard against attack from every quarter. 14. We can form a single united body, while the enemy must split up into fractions. Hence, there will be a whole pitted against separate parts of a whole, which means that we shall be many to the enemy's few. 15. And if we are able thus to attack an inferior force with a superior one, our opponents will be in dire straits. 16. The spot where we intend to fight must not be made known. For then the enemy will have to prepare against a possible attack at several different points. Sheridan once explained the reason of General Grant's victories by saying that while his opponents were kept fully employed wondering what he was going to do, he was thinking most of what he was going to do himself. And his forces being thus distributed in many directions, the numbers we shall have to face at any given point will be proportionately few. 17. For should the enemy strengthen his van, he will weaken his rear. Should he strengthen his rear, he will weaken his van. Should he strengthen his left, he will weaken his right. Should he strengthen his right, he will weaken his left. If he sends reinforcements everywhere, he will everywhere be weak. In Frederick the Great's instructions to his generals we read, a defensive war is apt to betray us into too frequent detachment. Those generals who have had but little experience attempt to protect every point, while those who are better acquainted with their profession, having only the capital object in view, guard against a decisive blow, and acquiesce in small misfortunes to avoid greater. 18. Numerical weakness comes from having to prepare against possible attacks. Numerical strength from compelling our adversary to make these preparations against us. The highest generalship in Colonel Henderson's words is to compel the enemy to disperse his army, and then to concentrate superior force against each fraction in turn. 19. Knowing the place and the time of the coming battle, we may concentrate from the greatest distances in order to fight. What Sun Tzu evidently has in mind is that nice calculation of distances and that masterly employment of strategy which enable a general to divide his army for the purpose of a long and rapid march, and afterwards to effect a junction at precisely the right spot and the right hour in order to confront the enemy in overwhelming strength. Among many such successful junctions which military history records, one of the most dramatic and decisive was the appearance of Blucher just at the critical moment on the field of Waterloo. 20. But if neither time nor place be known, then the left wing will be impotent to succor the right equally impotent to succor the left, the van unable to relieve the rear, or the rear to support the van. How much more so if the furthest portions of the army are anything under 100 li apart, and even the nearest are separated by several li. The Chinese of this last sentence is a little lacking in precision, but the mental picture we are required to draw is probably that of an army advancing towards a given rendezvous in separate columns, each of which has orders to be there on a fixed date. If the general allows the various detachments to proceed at haphazard, without precise instructions as to the time and place of meeting, the enemy will be able to annihilate the army in detail. Cheng Yu's note may be worth quoting here. If we do not know the place where our opponents mean to concentrate, or the day on which they will join battle, our unity will be forfeited through our preparations for defense, and the positions we hold will be insecure. Suddenly happening upon a powerful foe, we shall be brought to battle in a flurried condition, and no mutual support will be possible between wings, vanguard or rear, especially if there is any great distance between the foremost and hindmost divisions of the army. 21. Though according to my estimate the soldiers of Yue exceed our own in number, that shall advantage them nothing in the matter of victory. I say then that victory can be achieved. Alas for these brave words. The long feud between the two states ended in 473 B.C. with the total defeat of Wu by Ku Chen and its incorporation in Yue. This was doubtless long after Sun Tzu's death. With his present assertion compare IV. 4. Cheng Yu is the only one to point out the seeming discrepancy, which he thus goes on to explain. In the chapter on tactical dispositions, it is said, "One may know how to conquer without being able to do it," whereas here we have the statement that victory can be achieved. The explanation is that in the former chapter, where the offensive and defensive are under discussion, it is said that if the enemy is fully prepared, one cannot make certain of beating him. But the present passage refers particularly to the soldiers of Ye who, according to Sun Tzu's calculations, will be kept in ignorance of the time and place of the impending struggle. That is why he says here that victory can be achieved. 22. Though the enemy be stronger in numbers, we may prevent him from fighting. Scheme, so as to discover his plans and the likelihood of their success. An alternative reading offered by Qiaolin is, know beforehand all plans conducive to our success and to the enemy's failure. 23. Rouse him and learn the principle of his activity or inactivity. Cheng Yu tells us that by noting the joy or anger shown by the enemy on being thus disturbed, we shall be able to conclude whether his policy is to lie low or the reverse. He instances the action of Choku Liang, who sent the scornful present of a woman's headdress to Sima Ai, in order to goad him out of his Fabian tactics, force him to reveal himself, so as to find out his vulnerable spots. 24. Carefully compare the opposing army with your own, so that you may know where strength is superabundant and where it is deficient. F. IV. 6. 25. In making tactical dispositions, the highest pitch you can attain is to conceal them. The piquancy of the paradox evaporates in translation. Concealment is perhaps not so much actual invisibility, see Supre 9, as showing no sign of what you mean to do, of the plans that are formed in your brain. Conceal your dispositions, and you will be safe from the prying of the subtlest spies, from the machinations of the wisest brains. Chu Mu explains, though the enemy may have clever and capable officers, they will not be able to lay any plans against us. 26. How victory may be produced for them out of the enemy's own tactics. That is what the multitude cannot comprehend. 27. All men can see the tactics whereby I conquer, but what none can see is the strategy out of which victory is evolved. Everybody can see superficially how a battle is won. What they cannot see is the long series of plans and combinations which has preceded the battle. 28. Do not repeat the tactics which have gained you one victory, but let your methods be regulated by the infinite variety of circumstances. As Wang Xi sagely remarks, there is but one root principle underlying victory, but the tactics which lead up to it are infinite in number. With this compare Colonel Henderson. The rules of strategy are few and simple. They may be learned in a week. They may be taught by familiar illustrations or a dozen diagrams. But such knowledge will no more teach a man to lead an army like Napoleon than a knowledge of grammar will teach him to write like Gibbon. 29. Military tactics are like unto water, for water in its natural course runs away from high places and hastens downwards. 30. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. Like water, taking the line of least resistance. 31. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing. 32. Therefore, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare there are no constant conditions. 33. He who can modify his tactics in relation to his opponent, and thereby succeed in winning, may be called a heaven-born captain. 34. The 5 elements, water, fire, wood, metal, earth, are not always equally predominant. That is, as Wang Xi says, they predominate alternately. The 4 seasons make way for each other in turn. Literally, have no invariable seat. There are short days and long. The moon has its periods of waning and waxing. EF. E6. The purport of the passage is simply to illustrate the want of fixity in war by the changes constantly taking place in nature. The comparison is not very happy, however, because the regularity of the phenomena which Sun Tzu mentions is by no means paralleled in war. 1. See paralleled in war. Henderson's biography of Stonewall Jackson, 1902, ed. Volume E. 490.